Hi, welcome to Moreauknows. Today we're going to be learning about the essential knowledge for AP Biology class 2.A.2. We're going to see how organisms capture and store free energy for use in biological processes. Today we're just going to look at the photosynthetic overview. So our essential question for today, we got 3 of them, but we need to know, how do plants undergo photosynthesis? What are the limitations of photosynthesis? And what are the major steps in photosynthesis? Photosynthesis is the process that converts solar energy into chemical energy. And so if we look at the word photo, think of a photography, you need to take it with light. And synthesis means to combine, or make. And so we're converting solar energy into chemical energy, and that's the synthesis. Photosynthesis takes place in organisms that are autotrophs. Specifically, they're photoautotrophs, meaning that they carry out photosynthesis. Autotrophs just mean that they're organisms that can make organic molecules from inorganic molecules, like CO2, and we can make some carbon molecules, like carbohydrates. Almost all plants are photoautotrophs. They use light energy to make organic molecules from water and carbon dioxide. The basic formula for photosynthesis is quite simple. We have carbon dioxide going into the cell, water going into the cell, and light. All the things that a plant needs to survive. And then we get out of that, we get carbon-based organic molecules like carbohydrates, we get water, and we get oxygen that we breathe in. So here's the light energy hitting a leaf with carbon dioxide and water moving in, and we get out carbohydrates and oxygen. Where does photosynthesis take place? Well, if we look at a leaf and we see that we take a cross-section of that leaf, we're going to see a epidermis layer on the top and on the bottom, and the place where photosynthesis is going to occur is in the mesophyll of the center of the leaf. And there are things here that are called stomata that will actually allow for water and carbon dioxide and oxygen to move through, the vapors of water. That will allow for gas exchange and transpiration. Well, if we look at the mesophyll cell here on the edges of the epidermis layer, we're going to see these little round circles, and that's called a chloroplast. And if we look at a chloroplast more in detail, the chloroplast has an outer and inner membrane, which inside the membrane has the stroma, which is just all the space in between these little stacks. And these stacks are actually called thylakoids, and they have a membrane around them called a thylakoid membrane. The stacks of these thylakoids are called granum. You can see the cartoon depiction more clearly than the microscopic version, but you can still see these stacks of granum right here with little discs, and that's the thylakoids right there. And then the space in between, that is the stroma. A basic overview of photosynthesis in a chloroplast consists of energy from the sunlight moving down and hitting photosystems, which we'll explain a little bit later, in the thylakoid membrane. And that will excite electrons and actually break apart bonds in water. So this water will move in and oxygen will come out of the chloroplast. And this is going to produce ATP and NADPH. These are going to be the light-dependent reactions, meaning they're dependent on sunlight. And then that ATP and NADPH are going to go into something called the Calvin cycle. And this is where CO2 comes in. So our carbon dioxide will move into the Calvin cycle and create molecules of glucose. And this is light-independent reactions, meaning we don't need light for this to occur. And that will, in turn, produce ADP and NAD+, which will go back to the thylakoids and replenish themselves in the light-dependent reactions. So to look at this a little more closely, we have light moving in, hitting a thylakoid, that water and NAD+ and ADP from the Calvin cycle, which will be right here in a second, will move in, and that water will actually split. And that water splitting is going to create hydrogen ions to move to NADPH instead of NAD+, and then we're going to get a phosphate to add to ADP. So adenosine diphosphate plus 1 will be adenosine triphosphate. And we'll have oxygen leaving there, which we breathe in. And then those ATP and NADPH will actually rearrange molecules in the Calvin cycle, which will eventually get us sugar. And that's being used from carbon dioxide. And so then when we get sugar out, we'll actually leave out NAD plus and ADP, which will go back to the light reactions. And to conclude, we have the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions, meaning they don't have to use light. To look at this a little more closely, we have a thylakoid membrane, and on the thylakoid membrane we have something called a photosystem. This photosystem is on the thylakoid membrane and will actually produce and break down water into oxygen, while also going through the electron transport chain and creating ATP and NADPH, which is used in the Calvin cycle. And then that in turn will give back ADP and NAD+. What are the limitations on photosynthesis? And so I'm going to show you a couple things that are required for photosynthesis to occur and help move photosynthesis along a lot better. The first graph I'm going to show you is going to see how much reaction rate of photosynthesis occurs per light intensity. And so the light limited portion of this section is that it's limited by the light. And so if we had any exposure to light or any maximum exposure, photosynthesis would go on perfectly if we had the right temperature and the right level of CO2, or as much CO2 as we wanted. There's an excess of CO2. But if we cut down the temperature just a little bit from 35 degrees Celsius to 20 degrees Celsius, that rate of photosynthesis will drop by half. And we still have the same amount of carbon dioxide. Well, if we take out the temperature and we limit the carbon dioxide, that drops the amount of photosynthesis tremendously. And so light can be limited a little bit by temperature, but is mostly regulated by carbon dioxide. That's what's going to keep the rate of photosynthesis from going. From this, we can also look at what light is actually affecting a plant. So we can ask ourselves, why are plants green? The visible light is actually a small portion of the light rays that we can see. And so if we look, this is an electromagnetic spectrum, and if we increase in energy, we get gamma rays, but we also decrease in wavelength, which means that they're going to be really long. But we increase in energy. Over here with radio waves, they're going to be really, really fast. The wavelength is going to be rather small compared to the wavelength here. So that's a wavelength, and then this one's really big. Okay, but the energy is going to be bigger in gamma rays, and there's going to be less energy with radio waves. But in the middle we have our visible light, and this is where we get our colors of the rainbow and all of the color that we see around you right now. And so you can see this presentation. And so if plants are usually around here with the green color, what does that mean? It means that the plant cells are actually reflecting back to you the color green. And so the absorption is actually happening in all of these other colors. So it's absorbing this section of coloring and this section of coloring the most, or this wavelength and these wavelengths. And so it's really not using any green. It's reflecting that back to us so that we see green plants. If we look at how much light's being absorbed in different chlorophylls, we can see that right here at the 500 mark, we're absorbing everything that's lower than green. And at the 600 mark, we're absorbing all the wavelengths that are higher than the ones that are at green at about 550. And so right here's this dead space, and this is the colors that we see usually occurring in plants, are this green to yellow range. And so the absorption rate's really high over here, and really high over here, and really low. So it's reflecting back these colors and absorbing these colors. And this is where photosynthesis is happening, in these wavelength ranges right here. And so the chlorophyll molecule will actually be right on the edge here. And if a photon from the sun hits it, the photon will bounce all over the place and hit different chlorophyll molecules until it excites one of the chlorophylls. And if it excites the chlorophyll, it will excite an electron. And so the electron will actually be excited to an electron acceptor. And if we look at this, here's the chlorophyll, and here's an electron acceptor and an electron donor. And if we look at the light, it's hitting the chlorophyll, and it's at a non-excited state, meaning it's not excited. And once the light hits it, it becomes excited, meaning that it increases in energy. It moves up the chlorophyll molecule. And then the electron needs to go somewhere, so it goes to the electron acceptor. And the electron acceptor is just another molecule in the electron transport chain. And then once the chlorophyll moves its electron over, it will actually become oxidized. And then the electron acceptor will become reduced because it has a more negative molecule in it. Well, this electron donor is actually become reduced, and that's going to move into the oxidized chlorophyll, which will then become reduced again. And then the donor will become oxidized, which needs to accept an electron. So this cycle moves these electrons from the electron donor to the electron acceptor at an excited state from the chlorophyll. So again, to overview, when a photon hits a chlorophyll molecule, the photon will kind of bounce around, hit a reactor chlorophyll, it will excite an electron that will be moved down to an electron acceptor, producing ATP. And the ATP is the energy currency for all life on this planet. And then that will move down to another electron acceptor, going back down in this cycle, always producing ATP or energy from sunlight. Thank you for watching Moreauknows. Now you do.